Proposed herein is a policy renaissance based on improved aim and qualities to defend us by enabling and providing a fair and advantageous energy renaissance with an economy renaissance also. The S in defense would stand for a dirty dozen, I call it. S is plural, so I thought of a number of S's that would be qualities of this program. It would be strategic, systematic, synergistic. It would be synergistic in that $1 of government expenditure, instead of just say the government spending a dollar to get a clean investment, they'd be spending a dollar maybe in the short run to not only get a dollar of clean investment, but to take a dollar of dirty investment out of commission, out offline, out of production of emissions. So they'd be getting kind of a double value for the dollar, two bangs for the buck. Sensitive. It would also be sensitive because I think there needs to be a commission kind of guiding this framework, and rather than just a price on carbon that doesn't take into account what the economy is doing, if there's inflation, if there's unemployment, if this industry is transforming too fast for another industry, it's disrupting some other industry. If changing gasoline industry affects the auto industry or vice versa. We want those coordinated somewhat in an effective way. We want communities preserved. We need somebody that's overlooking these things and helping to prioritize and making sure that the economy's humming along with it. Sensitive when you're prioritizing the dirtiest things and getting them, putting your bucks towards that first, rather than having the market decide things on the basis of profitability, because you could have a very profitable, extremely dirty operation, or you could have a clean operation that's not as profitable. And if you just put a price on carbon, you could put the clean operation out of business and leave the dirty operation in business, even though the dirty operation would be getting a bigger financial penalty. If they're much more profitable to begin with, they may stay in business. The clean operation that maybe is barely profitable or less profitable may go out of business, even with a smaller impact on it. So prioritizing to get the dirtiest things offline first is another way to make your buck stretch further. Also being sensitive to the social welfare of the communities. You don't want a coal mining town to be totally decimated because there's no business left there. If you can, shut down an equally dirty operation somewhere where other jobs are to be had and retrained for in the same community and keep that community viable. It would be socially conscious. It would be strong. You'd have a stronger effect on emissions by attracting fossil fuel people with this program and compensating them and directly lowering emissions than just trying to set some ideal politically viable price at some magical point that doesn't exist, where you're going to way lower emissions without affecting the economy or people's having huge gas bills or electric bills. So you're not trying to somehow have an indirect effect, or you're not just expanding clean investments and hoping that magically takes dirty investments offline through competition when we have an insatiable appetite for energy. We can use it up. It's a sensible program. It's a stock preserving program. If you start taxing the heck out of fossil fuels to depress their business, their stock values should drop. And if you legislate them out of business, their stock values are devalued. So you got to worry about the stock market losing value, and a lot of institutions that have some stock in fossil fuels can be hurt through that, like colleges, for instance, might have stock in fossil fuels. But the framework I'm talking about shouldn't lower stock prices because we're keeping those businesses viable. We're being neutral financially to them. We're compensating them for the market value of the prioritized dirty assets that we're taking out of production, and we're directly lowering emissions. So it's sensible, it's strong, it's stock preserving, it's keeping stability of prices rather than causing inflation. We're not taxing gasoline way up so people can't afford to drive, and that's how we're lowering emissions. Instead, we'd be incentivizing gradual lowering of production of those emissions directly, and carbon emissions directly in a prioritized but sensible way, coordinated way, and not necessarily doing things that are going to raise the price of gas for consumers way up, and in a way that it inflates the whole economy, because everything is dependent on transportation and gas at this point. So it would send strong signals to the economy too, that we're serious. We have bipartisan agreement on this. We have the fossil fuel people agreeing to this. That would send huge, strong signals to the economy to start transforming to these cleaner energies in a fast and serious way. If they're no longer opposed, if this kind of transformation is no longer seen as frivolous or unneeded, but it's agreed that it's needed, and we're going to do it in a financially neutral, acceptable way and socially conscious way. And this framework would be success preserving. It would keep the economy going nicely. It wouldn't hurt the stock market. It wouldn't drive inflation, a strong inflationary thing. But it would be success preserving. It would help to systematically retrain people and shift those businesses into cleaner businesses, and shift those employees into those clean businesses, or help them to transition to other comparable work in their communities, or if they're willing to move somewhere else. And it would be sufficient. Let's hope it would be sufficient. It would be far stronger than a lot of goals that other environmental groups are hoping to hit and finding impossible to reach, even the weak goals that they're aiming for. This would be hopefully sufficient that we would have such a strong effect on directly lowering emissions on a quicker schedule. And it would be sustainable, because instead of having political reversals the next election, when the fossil fuel people get back in and undo everything that the environmentalists tried to do, or started to do, even in a weak way, it would be sustainable, because the whole country would be with the program, basically. They wouldn't be opposing it because it's hurting them. They would be, hopefully, get on board in an enthusiastic way to help preserve the climate. So there are a dirty dozen of qualities with S, starting with S: strategic, systematic, synergistic, sensitive. We're doing things in a socially conscious way. We want it to be sensitive, socially conscious, strong, sensible. It's got to make sense to everybody. It's stock preserving. It helps stability of prices. It's success preserving. It's sufficient and it's sustainable politically. I think that this framework, it doesn't depend on pushing and forcing things. It's a voluntary program for the most part. Just the smallest investment would be mandatory. And, and with that, you're not losing, you're not, a tax takes money out of your pocket. But to mandate that an investment just be another type of investment, it gives you tax forgiveness on this clean investment, small investment that you make. That it's mandatory, but why would that be upsetting to you if you're not going to lose on that investment? So, or if it's basically financially neutral. So, uh, so just the smallest part of the program, framework is mandatory and it's not repugnant. And the rest of it would be voluntary. It would be like a market that the government sets up. It would make offers to companies which they could refuse. It could negotiate with companies for the fair value of those dirty assets and then set up a schedule where you're going to benefit just as much from the clean assets as you would have from the dirty assets. And, and to cover the costs of transitions and stuff. And the government could even, this framework could even advance you the money to make that transition. So even in the short run, you're not losing money or shorter on cash or something. Uh, I think that over time, the government would recoup a lot of this expense in less disaster expenses in the future and less war expenses in the future. I think it could be paid for uh, largely through defense budgets, also voluntary bond sales, people voluntarily buying a climate change bond or an environment bond or something, if they think that's a good cause and a good investment. Uh, and forgiven taxes, that the government wouldn't collect some fraction of the taxes on the clean business for a period of time. But that clean business wouldn't have even existed if not for this framework. So for the government to give up that tax money, what's it really giving up? And you can say, well, the government's giving up tax money that it could have had on the dirty business. But the scientists are saying you can't have that dirty business and have a livable climate. So is the government really going to be able to tax that business, dirty business in the future anyway? Maybe or maybe not. So what's the government giving up? And if this program, even if the government loses somewhat financially, even if it is an expense on the part of the government. Once we get a clean energy system, the ceiling is off the economy. You can't run the economy full steam ahead, maybe without putting out so many emissions that you're killing yourself. But if you've transitioned the economy to a clean energy system, then there are no limits of, of, of using further energy and further energy, and, and getting that economy churning, in ways that are beyond our imagination now. So the profits could grow as the economy grows, and people get more confident that we've dealt with this crisis. There's more world unity because we fought and won this war together, all of humanity internationally, and uh, and people are happier that we don't have this conflict, constant back and forth conflict that's satisfying to neither side, in this struggle over what we do about this looming crisis and danger to us of the climate change. So maybe that confidence and security and, and, and clean energy that takes the ceiling off all leads to a renaissance, an energy renaissance, and an economic renaissance, and tax receipts could go up as business grows, as the economy grows, as profits grow. A lot of revenue will come in, extra revenue to the government, as opposed to spending a lot because of a growing climate crisis and all the consequential expenses of that. So, does it really even cost the government? In the long run, it may or may not even. I mean, the government may recoup it in a matter of decades. And even if the government did end up paying some, amount, and it never does recoup it, uh, if that saves us from disaster, climate disaster, it's a worthwhile investment for the government, is it not? Now, as for carbon pricing would play a part and would have a good role in terms of just being kind of a threat, that this is what may be tried in the future if things get bad enough, quick enough. But I would not suggest that. I think it's better that carbon pricing be a kind of a motivation to avoid that. The fossil fuel people want to avoid carbon pricing, and that motivation might help to motivate them to embrace a voluntary program. So carbon pricing can have played a valuable role, or can play a valuable role in that sense, I believe, as a motivating thing. In a way, it would almost be like a symbol of the looming worse climate change crisis that looms in the future if we don't take care of things in a better way, in a timely fashion. So carbon pricing maybe is not totally in vain as an idea. It may have its use. But for fossil fuels, people who want to avoid it very much so, carbon pricing and taxes, I think this voluntary thing is a good way to go. And as I've said, I think environmentalists should embrace it because carbon pricing is just not, I don't see it as being politically viable. I don't see that the fossil fuels people will accept it anytime soon or to any strong extent, or keeping it in, even if they put it in with intention of making it strong over time. They'll probably decide later on, no, let's get rid of it before it has much impact. And that's happened in a couple places where they've legislated carbon pricing in, and then they've gotten rid of it before it did much of anything or became strong in impact. So I don't see it as politically viable. A voluntary program, I think, would be politically viable. Why wouldn't it? Why wouldn't it be viable to give them a choice to participate and to make it obvious that we're spreading the burden and they are getting compensated, they're getting retrained, they're getting their stocks being maintained, prices are fairly stable? Why would that be so repugnant to them as would taxes or carbon pricing that depresses their business and drives them out of business over time? So there you have it, the double tip, triple dip defense. So I've laid out a framework that is voluntary largely, and I think if fossil fuels communities want to achieve their main goals in a lasting way of preserving their lifestyles and their stocks and wealth and jobs and communities and so forth in a lasting way, then they should embrace a largely voluntary program that might satisfy the environmentalists. And I think the environmentalists, rather than sticking to their guns on carbon pricing that they've been pushing for 40 years or 30 years and not been able to push through, they ought to embrace a voluntary program that entices rather than pushes the fossil fuel community to clean transformation. Even compliance is a complication when you have a program that pushes with punitive taxes. People will try to evade those taxes and try to move their operations or whatever, conceal things. But when you have a program which makes offers that are attractive, then companies are drawn to it. You don't have, and compliance is less of an issue, and hiding things and evading things, because you're offering them the opportunity to lower their risks, financial risks. You're offering them the opportunity to achieve their main goals while they take care of the business of dealing with climate change and lowering emissions. So you're offering them the opportunity to affordably and neutrally be on the right side of history rather than having to martyr themselves to be on the right side of history. And I encourage environmentalists to support this idea of a voluntary program and for themselves to get on the right side of history in terms of participating with this voluntary program and advancing it. And I think that it will clean dirty emissions faster than any tax or carbon pricing, and it will become something that can be acted on, that's politically viable, and that will stay viable, stay in effect, and have its effect over time, and hopefully get those emissions down quicker than anything now being discussed or contemplated. This video and this framework that I've described simply herein is, generally speaking, designed for the United States. But I believe that many aspects of it could be adapted to the local cultures of many countries around the world. I think largely it's based on economic tendencies and market tendencies that are worldwide, incentives that are based on people's human behavior within a market system, basically. And so a lot of it could possibly be helpful around the world for other countries to think about how they can deal with lowering emissions on a reasonable schedule to hopefully stave off disasters. And now, when you have a country that is very dependent on fossil fuels, maybe the lion's share of their economy is dealing with fossil fuels, I believe that the UN should probably, and maybe the World Bank and various international organizations should probably try to arrange things so that they are able to stay in business the longest with their and not have as much burden of transformation. A country like the United States that has many economic opportunities or probably should be expected to try to transform itself in a quicker way. And a country with fossil fuels leading their economy in a dominating way, they should probably be allowed to continue with less strict targeted goals for lowering their emissions. And but to the extent that they can, and in voluntary ways, I think maybe some of these same methods could possibly maybe they can be creative enough draw some help from some of these same ideas of transforming over time and starting to encourage clean business, clean energy, looking for opportunities, but they should be concerned as well about climate, and many of them don't have as much margin for error because they're hot climates, and we've got to really get progress quickly on the climate change front to spare them from disastrous heat. So So the video was made primarily for the U.S., but it could be of relevance to other countries as well, and they may also be very concerned that the U.S. just have progress with our own emissions, with U.S. emissions, and hopefully we will join the rest of the world in meeting those targets for lowering emissions and even doing better, hopefully, than that. So I feel like I have this framework, and it's not easy to communicate it, but it's a double TIP tax incentive program, transformative investment prioritizations. It's triple DIP. It's disinvestment progress. It's diversifying investment profits, and it's dipping into the process. It's dipping into a progression, the transformation to clean, and double TIP, triple DIP, and it's defense. It's defensive environmental funding. It's because it's a war that we're faced with, thrust upon us by the climate and history, the whole history of economic development through centuries of fossil fuels. It's defensive environmental funding with equitable neutrality, financial neutrality for the fossil fuel communities, and it's a dirty dozen of S's. It's strategic, systematic, it's synergistic, it's sensitive, it's socially conscious, it's strong, it's sensible, it's stock preserving, it's stability of prices, it's success preserving, it's sufficient, and it's sustainable politically, hopefully. I would think it would be. And the E, the final E in defense, is for energization, I would call it. And it's energization of climate action, because I think this can break the stalemate. It's energization of the economy, because it lifts the lid off the economy once the energy is not killing us. It will lift the lid on the economy, I believe, and I think it'll stimulate the economy, keep the economy as healthy as it is, and it'll build on that. It'll build on people's confidence, and it'll create a lot of new work and a lot of new businesses, a lot of new profits. And it's energization in terms of energy as well. So it's defensive environmental funding with equitable neutrality, the dirty dozen S's, and its energization, hopefully, of action. Finally, here's an overall summary of how these elements work together, how the framework basically works. First, we expand our aims. We'll aim to both preserve the standards of living, earnings, and wealth and communities of the fossil fuels communities and businesses, but also, while we also aim to preserve the livable climate by lowering emissions in timely and active fashion. In order to become politically viable and sustainable politically, we will satisfy the legitimate concerns of the fossil fuels communities, guided by a central principle, equitable neutrality, that we will not hurt them financially, but we will instead compensate them with comparable work and comparable value and success, and in preserving their communities as much as possible. We extend equitable neutrality so these various stakeholders don't lose via the framework and policy. And for even further political viability, there will be no associated taxes nor fees. And the participation of businesses will be largely and essentially on a volunteer basis. We will use a tax incentives program, strategic forgiveness of taxes, in such a way as to entice fossil fuels businesses to gradually reinvest into clean business and clean energy in such a way as to retire prioritized dirty operations quicker and accelerate their own reinvestment in clean energy and clean business. By voluntary means, this will shift substantial capital from fossil fuels into timely, profitable, and necessary transformative investments in a way that is fairly and financially neutral and most effective in directly reducing emissions. Now, the tax incentive program and transformational investment prioritization will not only stimulate investment into clean energy and business, but will also directly result in disinvestment progress out of dirty business, lowering emissions directly. Sensitive to the well-being of businesses and the economy, and sensitive to and protective of the social well-being and ongoing viability of communities as well. Now, to compensate them will involve huge expense, which necessitates what I would call defensive environmental funding. We acknowledge that transforming the economy from dirty to clean will require huge investment and transformation beyond ordinary market and private capacities. So we act in bringing the federal government actively into facilitating, coordinating, initiating, and further financing of this huge effort at economic transformation. We also address how to minimize the costs and stretch our resources to get double impacts and great bang for the buck, and quicker and more transformative investment. We also can use a handful of creative means of financing in order to avoid any need to raise burdensome taxes. In financing the huge defensive environmental funding,
We intend to largely stretch payments over decades, much lowering the burdens of any point in time, but also much of the expense may be financed by forgiving hypothetical future taxes that are really, in fact, phantom funds that can never really be collected in any case. Essentially using these merely hypothetical but uncollectible taxes, getting value for them through the very act of forgiving them in the short run. These phantom funds will then, and only then, find use and value to exert impact rather than the government passively waiting until these hypothetical future taxes prove uselessly uncollectible in the long run. For further defensive environmental funding, we suggest an international agreement so that all nations devote some fraction of their defense funds to the mutual worldwide defense against climate change disasters, because we acknowledge the great challenge to every nation's security that arises from global climate change, and which altogether requires a serious defensive effort of huge scale. We also suggest the use of an equivalent of a war bond campaign, raising funds via government bonds, paying competitive interest and tax-free for this great cause of defending ourselves from climate catastrophe. In the USA, for instance, voluntary participation in bond sales raised about 2/3 of our total expense on World War I and raised over half of our total expense on World War II. Voluntary bond sales. And through these voluntary bond sales, people who are concerned about being on the right side of history can place themselves on the right side of history by investing in this defense effort for a safe future. Stimulation of the economy and resulting increases in revenues will likely also offset a significant portion of the costs of this overall policy and program. Through these various means of financing, we will avoid any necessity of raising taxes via a compensating and prioritized tax incentive program, creatively financed and involving no taxes and most largely voluntary. A strong and timely means of directly reducing emissions becomes politically acceptable, well affordable, involves low risk, and which is also entirely more protective than further years of delay and inaction. This overall program is in accord with the overwhelming preponderance of scientific analyses. It should encourage and stimulate a strong economy and maintain and grow standards of living, whether climate change grows more destructive or not, and gives us our best and strongest help regarding emissions if worsening climate does in fact continue, and in fact may intensify much as scientifically predicted. So again, as to the benefits of this program, the tax incentive program of forgiving taxes in return for transforming investments will not only compensate the retiring of dirty fossil fuels assets, it will also lower business risks. It will help avoid inflation of energy prices, gasoline and electricity included, of course. It will help avoid general inflation. It will help maintain and grow stock market values. It will stimulate further investments in clean business throughout the economy at large. It will lower the degree of future disasters, tragedies, emergencies, instabilities, desperation, violence, and future excessive pressures on defense expenditures and efforts, and excessive needs to replace damaged infrastructure, saving many and huge future expenses. This plan need not necessarily exclude various other efforts, some of which may also have potentials to help greatly. Efforts involving attention to deforestation, agricultural methods, desertification, the creation of deserts or prevention of that, and attending to ocean impacts, thawing of tundra, releasing methane gases, and so on. Efforts in addressing these regards might all be very worthy of funding as well. And this tax incentive program, under the oversight and direction of a guiding commission and administration, will bring about transformative investments in a prioritized and coordinated way, sensitive to and protective of the well-being of businesses and the economy, and also sensitive to and protective of the social well-being and ongoing viability of communities as well. And these concerns will be anticipated and addressed far beyond any such sensitivity and considerations offered within taxation policies. The public acceptance of these tax arrangements, tax forgiveness arrangements, fair compensation, volunteer participation, volunteer funding, and funding without raising taxes. The public acceptance of all that cannot be compared to how the public will or will not accept taxation and higher energy prices, nor all that can imply for the rest of the economy and businesses and communities. Via this policy framework, we will have a prioritized tax incentive program involving tax forgiveness and phantom funds, providing huge savings, creatively financed and involving no taxes, no further taxes, and most largely voluntary participation by businesses, fairly compensating fossil fuels communities, owners, investors, employees. And through this, we will have a strong and timely means of directly reducing emissions, and a means that will become politically acceptable and viable as a action that we can actually do and having impact on emissions in a strong way. It will be well affordable, it would involve low risk, and it would be entirely more protective than further years of inaction or decades of further inaction and further plans that will not be politically acceptable. I find it difficult to imagine that we'll have a more workable plan anytime in the foreseeable future with low risk and better probabilities for success in significantly lowering emissions in timely and reliable fashion. And I certainly hope and pray that you and all the good people of the United States will recognize the exceptional merits of this plan and framework. put your faith in it and let's implement this strong defensive action. There's much work to be done to meet somewhat urgent challenges, and we need to get on with it. So the shortest summary that I can give you of the framework and how it works is that basically we're looking to compensate the fossil fuel communities fairly and neutrally. They won't win, they won't have a big gain or anything. It's not a way for them to make extra money, but they won't lose. They're going to break even. And it's going to be fair and not hurt them, not put the whole burden on them. And that goes for investors, owners, employees, the whole fossil fuel industry. And we're going to buy out their dirty assets as the fastest way that we can lower emissions. There won't be any faster or more direct way to lower emissions, period. That's my opinion anyway. And if there's a plan out there that can do that faster, I'd like to see it. Where is it? And I believe it would be politically acceptable because it's fair and it won't hurt people. It won't hurt the very people who've been opposing almost every climate action, which they did perceive would have hurt them. So it's politically acceptable, it's fair, it'll get emissions down quicker than anything else. There are no taxes. It's largely voluntary participation by business. That's the essential elements of the whole framework. What more could you ask for? Really? I mean, what more do you want in a policy to address climate change? Thank you.